Hi, this is Tomas, and this is the second of the Studying for Exams videos on how to remember better. What we'll look at is 5 characteristics of memory that make things easier to remember. We'll look at making things more meaningful, more visual, more emotionally and personally engaged, condensed and organized, and finally, talk about creating a habit of study and memorization. The first characteristic of memory is that it's meaningful. In other words, you remember things when they mean something to you. If you look at the right side of the slide, you'll see a bunch of bubbles. Let's imagine these bubbles are notes or materials from your lecture. If you just approach them as physical pages, you'll see a lot of disorganized material. But if you step back and try to get a sense of what is the core idea, what is the meaning of that, you might end up with a very different structure. Most lectures are structured alongside 1 or 2 major concepts, which are deeper developed throughout examples and other applications. If you do this with your lectures, what you're going to create for yourself is a structure of meaning that will help you understand all the small details because it'll relate to larger ideas. So the first thing to do would be to look at the material, try to identify the larger, complex ideas that guide the material, and then try to see where the smaller examples, definitions, or words belong. This is called chunking, clustering concepts, ideas, and materials along related ideas. What chunking does for you is to break down the material into a manageable amount of things which are moreover related by meaning. Now, to do this effectively, you can apply all kinds of things. The most common ones are critical thinking, logic, and etymology. Critical thinking basically amounts to asking questions. If you have a lot of material, ask yourself, why do we have 3 categories? Why is it this way? Why is this related to something else? And so on. This way, you help yourself establish context, establish connections, and start thinking more deeply with the material. But more importantly, every connection you create, when it's meaningful, effectively strengthens and fortifies your existing memory so you remember these things better and can apply them in real life, which is the actual point of the whole exercise. Logic works on the same level. You can think of causal relationships, what causes one thing or another. You can look at structural relationships and all kinds of other things that you can find. As long as it makes sense, you're making logical connections. If all fails, and let's say you come across a word that is very difficult to remember, think about etymology. Literally means origins of words from Greek. Most scientific terms will have roots coming in from Greek or from Latin, simply because of history of how science developed. But what that means is that a lot of the very unintelligible prefixes and suffixes, like ana, kata, crypto, hyper, heliotrope, and so on, are actually very stable. If you look up their meaning, you'll realize that a lot of these very funny sounding words actually make a lot of sense and are quite structured. So if ana means above and kata means below, you can think of things like anabolic, catabolic, or anion, cation, which all refer to up or down relationship between things. Same thing goes for crypto, which is hidden, hyper, meaning too much. Things like heliotrope, well, you can think about what it means. If that doesn't work for you, make stuff up. Make a meaning that works for you. If you, let's say, are talking about phylogenesis, which is the creation of phyla or divisions, you can think of philodo, which has layers, and if that makes sense to you, create yourself a mental image of that gives you a meaning, and there you go, you remember it. This brings us to another aspect of memory, and that it's visual. If you can imagine something, it will make it much more easy to remember. Mind automatically ties things to images. Even if you think of an abstract comment, something comes to mind, an image, an experience that you can really visualize. The authors of textbooks know this very well. On the right side of the page, you'll see an example of a schematic illustration of a plant cell. Now, what it does is simplifies the structure of the cell, but the real purpose of this kind of drawing is to create for you a visualization. When you're studying this material, you don't just see abstract concepts like chloroplast, mitochondria, plasma membrane, and so on. What you see is a big blue bubble in the middle, something green above it, a purple thing on the right, and a red thing on the left. When you close your eyes, you can visualize those things. This is what we call a mnemonic background or a memory background that helps your memory locate things and easily retrieve them. If you use this characteristic, you can actually make learning material much more fun, much more interesting, but also much more lasting. The third characteristic of memory is that it is emotional and personal. Every memory you make is your particularly own memory. Now, what does that mean for learning? It means two things. First of all, if you cannot engage with material on a personal level, if you're bored, you don't like it, don't understand it, it'll be very difficult to remember it because there's no attachment, no desire to know it. So when studying, when you find yourself losing track, trailing off, not being interested, think about the ways how you can make this interesting. What you can do is just use your imagination to make it more vivid, more striking. Draw, doodle, outline, so that you understand, but also get engaged. When you get the moment, when you actually really know what's going on, that is the moment when you're starting to get emotionally. Another strategy would be to think about implications that are really relevant to something that you want to do. Another side of the fact that memory is emotional is that our own emotional states can determine how we remember. If you're too excited, newly fallen in love, if you're depressed, very unhappy, or angry, it will be quite difficult to remember simply because your mind, your emotions are somewhere else and you cannot process the information. And in that case, it might be quite useful to take a brief break, take a deep breath, go away, take a walk, and study after that. The fourth characteristic of memory is that it likes brevity. You can memorize a lot of things. You can know tremendous amount of information, but if you try to approach it, especially for exams, as trying to cram a lot of material, as should become clear by now, you will probably not succeed very well. So what we need to do is to chunk, to organize, and to make it as easy for memory as possible. Rule number one, organize. Organize, organize, organize your notes, your materials, identify the big concepts, chunk your material into distinct blocks, and identify how things are related. This way, what you'll start producing is something like this image of a tree, where you will have a core idea, and out of that core idea, you will see branches of larger concepts and smaller concepts. This way, you can capture a lot of information, but you will not be confused because all the small information will belong to a larger idea, and you will be able to navigate yourself through that. And this is a key to successful exam study and to study in general. And finally, memory is a habit. Now, this is probably the most painful thing to hear, but although you may have an amazing memory, although you may have created very, very amazing, meaningful diagrams and visualize it as you can, it's always useful to go over this material again and again. Now, there are several things to keep in mind here. First of all, if you want to become an expert in something, you need to be able to draw automatically on basic concepts. And we know this from study of experts because they really don't think on a certain level of pulling up those words and concepts because they've done it so many times, they actually have that coded automatically in their memory. And that is only happening once you've practiced again and again. And therefore, when you're starting especially and study is hard, don't worry, you'll get there. Learn your vocabulary, understand it. What are the concepts? What are the words? What are the hierarchies? This way you can free up your short-term memory and start thinking on a higher level. Secondly, build on what you know. If you know another language, if you have another experience, if you can think of other related things, use that in your study. Use it for examples, use it in applications. Think about how you can use all those other skills to make study more interesting and more applicable to you. As long as you get the answers, you're on the right track. And finally, think about developing a study habit. Memory, in some ways, can be thought of as a muscle. The more you exercise it, the better it gets. And when you cram, when you try to do things without much preliminary exercise, it's not surprising that your memory might fail, just like after going to a gym, you might feel very, very sore the next day after. What this video has outlined is 5 basic characteristics of memory that can help you when studying and remembering things. So remember, make things meaningful, make them visual, make them emotional and personal, make them condensed and organized, and finally, think about developing a habit.